The hearing will come to order. I want to welcome everybody to the Budget Committee hearing on biennial budgeting. We have a few logistical challenges this morning. Mr. Van Hollen has been delayed, and he will be here as soon as he can. Mr. Price is also not able to be here until about 10 o'clock, but we'll proceed, and I think that will still work in terms of one panel. The first panel being Congressman Ribble and Congressman Price, and then the second panel being our other panelists, and we'll proceed as we had agreed. Today's hearing is part of our ongoing effort here at the House Budget Committee to focus time and attention on reforming the congressional budget process. To understand the impetus for reform, one need only look at the history of writing budgets under the current process. Deadlines are routinely missed, sometimes deliberately. Appropriations bills are often combined into massive omnibus measures that give little time for proper review. All of this is occurring because the budget process is outdated and cumbersome and needlessly complex and almost impossible to understand. It encourages more government spending by default, and most disturbing, its shortcomings can lead to the erosion of Congress's power of the purse, further ceding authority to the executive branch and diminishing the role of the legislature in our constitutional framework. The degradation of budgeting impedes our ability to govern responsibly. These aren't conditions that can be cured with a few piecemeal remedies. That's why this committee has called for a wide-ranging, wholesale approach to reforming the budget process, to upend the current system and start over with policies that will enforce budget and fiscal discipline and reinforce constitutional government. Early this year, our committee held a hearing on the first principles of budget process reform. In that hearing, we discussed many of the challenges we face in this endeavor and the guiding principles that should lead our reform effort. Those include exercising constitutional control to ensure a healthy balance of power between the legislative and executive branches, promoting fiscal responsibility, increasing oversight, and developing a better understanding of how much money government programs and policies are actually costing American taxpayers. Those principles should help guide our consideration of individual budget reform solutions as well. As chairman of the House Budget Committee, I welcome and encourage anyone who's willing to engage in this conversation and has interest to bring ideas to us. As members of Congress, we have a vested interest in having a budget process that is more easily understood and better equipped to positively inform our broader legislative efforts. The American people have everything to gain from a budget process that forces their elected representatives to govern in a more efficient, effective, and accountable manner. So we all have reason to participate in this effort, and that's why I'm grateful to have our colleague, Congressman Reid Ribble, here today to discuss his biennial budgeting proposal. Biennial budgeting as a concept is not a new idea. Indeed, it has been, in one form or another, part of the budget process reform discussion as far back as the enactment of the original 1974 Budget Act. Today, our goal is to further the discussion and examine the merits of biennial budgeting to answer the question, does biennial budgeting fit in a rewrite of the budget process? That's the same question that we'll need to ask of each and every potential solution that might come forward as we work on this endeavor. Any potential reform should be viewed in the context of an overhaul of the entire budget process and where it fits into the broader goals laid out in our principles. And through transparent consideration and scrutiny of each proposal, we will advance this cause in a fair and constructive manner. Biennial budgeting is an idea that deserves rigorous debate to better understand what the implications would be for the work of this committee, for our appropriators, for the authorizing committees, and our shared pursuit of oversight over the nation's fiscal well-being. Were we to shift to biennial budgeting, it would fundamentally change how Congress operates, and therefore all of its ramifications should be weighed carefully and thoughtfully. I look forward to hearing Congressman Ribble's testimony on his bill, and Congressman David Price, who will join us shortly, who has had a long interest in this subject. And I look forward to hearing from our second panel of budget experts who will be able to lend their expertise to this discussion. We'll hear from Alice Rivlin, former director of the Congressional Budget Office and now a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Rudy Penner, a former director also of the CBO and now a fellow at the Urban Institute. And Philip Joyce, the senior associate dean and professor at the University of Maryland School of Public Policy. I want to thank all of you for taking time out of your schedules to be here. The committee looks forward to your testimony and discussing the potential pros and cons of moving to a biennial budgeting system. And as I stated at the outset, our congressional budget process has a profound impact on far more than just the budgets we produce in this committee. It is fundamental to the constitutional responsibilities of Congress, as well as our duty as elected representatives, to be good stewards of the tax dollars of hardworking Americans. With that in mind, I look forward to a positive and a productive discussion. At this time, I would normally yield or recognize the ranking member. However, again, he has been detained for a period of time, and so I recognize the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Yarmouth, for the ranking member's opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I would say at the outset that this clearly is not a partisan issue. There are Democrats who support the Ribble proposal and some who oppose it. I think the ranking member, it's safe to say, as his statement will illustrate, does not favor it. I'm a co-sponsor of the bill, along with several other of my colleagues. So with that, it gives me great pleasure to present Mr. Van Hollen's opening statement. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know there is both support and opposition for the Biennial Budgeting and Enhanced Oversight Act on both sides of the aisle, and I hope this is a useful hearing for closely examining the pros and cons of the bill. But we should be very clear about what the bill does not do. It does nothing to resolve the underlying political differences behind our budgeting problems. We should not pretend that moving from annual to biennial budgeting or any other tinkering with the budget process will do anything to convince Tea Party Republicans to agree to govern. They have abused the process by holding the budget hostage to unrelated political goals. Congress is responsible for developing a budget laying out its priorities for government spending and revenues. But the Tea Party doesn't want to make tough decisions about allocating resources across competing programs. They want to cut the size of government, repeal the Affordable Care Act, and defund Planned Parenthood. They don't care about the effect on the government's ability to continue to provide services that are vital to the American public. They want to make political points by shutting down the government. That is the fundamental problem we are having in governing and budgeting. No change in the budget process will fix that problem. That said, there are undoubtedly some improvements that could be made to any complex process, including the budget process. If there are measures that at the margins improve things, we should take those actions. If at the margins they don't improve things, we shouldn't move forward. We've considered Congressman Ribble's bill before, and while I think it's a close call, I still come down marginally in opposition for several reasons that I hope will be discussed at today's hearing. First, one of the bill's goals is to improve oversight by removing the time spent on annual appropriations, leaving more time the second year to conduct oversight. But I think the annual budget review process is what most engages the attention of federal agencies. It's not clear whether agencies will take Congress as seriously if we don't have the power in the second year to hold them accountable for their budget. I'm sure my colleagues on the Appropriations Committee will talk about that. Second, it's hard enough to accurately forecast economic conditions and needs 1 year in advance, but doing it 2 years in advance is even harder. We won't have new information about how a program is performing or if we should redirect federal resources elsewhere. This is likely to lead to maintaining the status quo and freezing funding for 2 years rather than reevaluating priorities and adjusting spending accordingly. I think this is part of why more states have moved away from biennial budgeting in recent years. Currently, 19 states have some sort of 2-year budget, much less than the 44 states with biennial budget cycles in 1940. Third, there are provisions in the Ribble bill that will make the budget process less transparent and that are entirely unrelated to biennial budgeting. One provision will change the budget resolution to remove the current functional split. Currently, the budget lays out priorities in each function, showing where it increases and decreases funding. This bill makes that more opaque by condensing all funding into 6 categories, lumping all non-health related direct spending in one category, with the function split only displayed in the committee report that is not available during markup and which is never voted on. This change would make it harder to identify cuts this year's Republican budget resolution proposed for programs like SNAP and student loans. Why would we want to provide less information in the budget, and what does this have to do with putting the budget on a biennial basis? I have some additional concerns about the bill that I think will be addressed by others today. We know that process reforms alone are rarely successful in leading to major changes in fiscal policies when there is stark disagreement on the size and scope of government, as there is now. Changes were more successful when they were done to implement agreed-upon budgetary changes, not enforcing agreement in the first place. I think it's good that we're thinking about the budget, and I look forward to hearing from our expert witnesses. However, I'm not optimistic that any process change will have much effect on the problems we have, which are far more political than process-related. Thank you, and I yield back.
thank the gentleman for reading the ranking member's opening statement. I'm happy to yield to the ranking member for a comment if he'd like.
Well, first of all, let me thank my colleague, Mr. Yarmouth. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I obviously won't repeat what my colleague just said, but I do want to say to Congressman Ribble, I do think this is a really good faith effort. There are obviously disagreements on both sides as to the merits. I do think sometimes there's a temptation to believe that process change will somehow fix the much deeper policy and political issues. I don't think that's the case, but there may be opportunities to make adjustments that take us in the right direction. I think on balance, as my statement said, this one falls on the side of not making a change in the right direction, but I do want to commend you for the effort, and I think this is a really good debate for us to have. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I ask unanimous consent that any members who wish to submit a statement for the record may do so within 7 calendar days. In order to allow Mr. Price, who I am assured is on his way, to attend another engagement and to reserve sufficient time for our members to question the second panel, I ask unanimous consent that the questions for our first panel of witnesses, Mr. Ribble and Mr. Price, be limited to Mr. Van Hollen and me. All other members will have an opportunity to fully question our second panel of expert witnesses. Without objection, so ordered. I'd now like to welcome the first of our witnesses, Mr. Ribble. Thank you for your time today. The committee has received your written statement, and without objection, it will be made part of the formal hearing record, and you will have 5 minutes to deliver your oral remarks. Mr. Ribble, you may begin when you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I also want to thank Ranking Member Van Hollen. I've had a good working relationship with both of you gentlemen, and it's been helpful in this bipartisan effort. I want to thank the committee this morning for holding this hearing. As a former member of the committee, I'm happy to be back today to express my views on Congress' current budget process and how I believe we can improve it to make Congress work better, smarter, and more efficiently. I believe that biennial budgeting reform has 228 co-sponsors supporting it because the current budget process has simply not worked, and it's only gotten worse. Since the Congressional Budget Act was enacted in 1974, Congress has never passed both a budget resolution and all of its appropriation bills on time in the same year. Never. Not even once. And you can see in the slide, it gets worse in election years. In the 40-year history of the current budget process, only one time has Congress enacted a budget resolution on time in an election year. That was in 1976, just 2 years after the 74 Act was signed into law. In fact, in the last 17 years, Congress has failed to even pass a budget in election years 77% of the time. Because of Congress' failure to complete its work, we're forced to rely on continuing resolutions or omnibus appropriation bills that are hastily passed, usually without improvements to programs that could come from effective oversight. Given 4 decades of failure, let me explain why I feel biennial budgeting should be part of the solution. First, biennial budgeting will provide greater certainty by moving the budget decisions furthest away from election year politics, greatly enhancing the likelihood of passing a budget and providing a budget in an election year. It's not lost on me that the majority of our colleagues on the House Armed Services Committee support this effort in part for that reason. Second, having a budget for 2 years will reduce the need for frequent stopgap measures like continuing resolutions. CRs aren't just bad government, they're missed opportunities for Congress to put its stamp on how the executive branch should operate. Third, moving to a biennial process would free up more time on the House floor to tackle mandatory spending and tax policy and other essential work. The 2016 congressional calendar has only 12 work weeks from May through September. In essence, the only thing Congress will do next summer is appropriations. Biennial budgeting opens up more time for Congress to do all of its work. If you could bring up the second slide. Fourth, not only will biennial budgeting tilt Congress' focus to oversight, it will also reduce the use it or lose it mentality that wastes precious taxpayer dollars at the end of every fiscal year. Nearly 20% of all federal spending occurs in the last few weeks of the year, and nearly a $35 billion increase in average spending on the last week. In week 52, I'd like you to look at the top 3 slides there. That high line is the last week of spending. That's week 52. On average, it's a $35 billion. I want to repeat that, a $35 billion spike in spending in the last week. So we can fix this. I realize that any reform proposals put forth, some will favor the status quo. That's most certainly the case here. There's certain comfort with what you know, even when you know it isn't working. No organization on the planet embraces the status quo like the Congress of the United States. We should not let the perfect become the enemy of the good, nor should we let comfort with the status quo become a barrier to fixing a broken system. Now, I don't argue that biennial budgeting is a panacea, because it isn't, and those who oppose it offer some key critiques, and I'd like to take a moment to respond. First, critics argue that politics is to blame, not the annual budgeting process, and quite frankly, that opinion is not without merit. But that isn't a critique of biennial budgeting, it's a critique of Congress as a whole. It is politics that have kept us from budgeting at all in election years. If anything, biennial budgeting improves the outlook and steers the process away from politics rather than toward it. Members of both parties can and should work together more often, as they have done with this piece of legislation. Let's not let politics stop this bipartisan effort. Second, critics argue that supplemental appropriation bills will be needed too often, and that is through the appropriations process that you eliminate waste. Regarding supplemental approps, history has shown us Congress tends to write supplemental appropriation bills sparingly. There's absolutely no reason to believe that that would change under biennial budgeting. Regarding waste, one only needs to look at the Washington Post data to see the failure in ending wasteful spending. In conclusion, biennial budgeting is an idea whose time has come. The House is seeking to work its will, Mr. Chairman. I would like to bring up slide number 3. And I want to show you the broad bipartisan support in this Congress. In fact, during the last Congress, and just a little over a year ago, this very committee passed this exact same bill with your supporting vote, Mr. Chairman. Since I have been in Congress, this was the only bill passed out of the House Budget Committee on recorded vote that had broad bipartisan support. And I have members from the Republican Study Committee, the Tuesday Group, the Freedom Caucus, the Blue Dog Coalition, the New Democrat Coalition, and the Progressive Caucus, all as co-sponsors on this bill. That hardly ever happens in this Congress. Hardly ever. However, support is not just inside the Congress. If you could bring up slide 4. We have broad support outside from both conservative and progressive groups. That said, I know the bill could use some tweaking. I want all of you in this committee to know that I'm eager and ready to work with you to improve the bill as it moves forward. But time is of the essence, and I encourage you to promptly move to a markup and continue this important work. There's a bipartisan majority of members of this committee on this bill. Once again, thank you for this opportunity. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Ribble. Appreciate it. Mr. Price, welcome. We appreciate your flexibility. I understand that you have another engagement at the bottom of the hour, and we look forward to your testimony, and then Mr. Van Hollen and I will be questioning this panel. So, Mr. Price, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
There we go. All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Van Hollen, other members of the committee. I appreciate the chance to appear before you today, and I will submit my full testimony for the record. I first testified about this question of biennial budgeting 15 years ago before the House Rules Committee, which was considering legislation to transition Congress to a biennial budget and appropriations process. Then our nation's fiscal situation was quite different. The enactment of multi-year budget agreements in 90, 93, and 97, coupled with a growing economy, had produced several years of balanced budgets. They actually allowed us to pay down more than $400 billion of the national debt. Well, that's not where we are today. Since then, we've had trillions of dollars in lost tax revenue. We've had 2 unpaid-for wars. We've had a necessary but expensive countercyclical response to the Great Recession. And most recently, we've had 5 years of extremely partisan and largely dysfunctional congressional budget politics. So it's understandable that the idea of biennial budgeting would once again hold some appeal for members in search of solutions to our current woes. But I truly think this is a case where the remedy is worse than the disease. Now, I'm the first to agree that the congressional budget and appropriations processes have eroded significantly in recent years. The pressures of divided government, a polarized electorate, the general subjugation of Congress's constitutional power of the purse to partisan political considerations. All this has greatly delayed the enactment of our annual spending bills. It's increased our reliance on continuing resolutions and omnibus packages. Not to mention the damage that's been done by the consolidation of power within leadership circles at the expense of appropriations and other committees. But biennial budgeting, by which I really mean biennial appropriations, would do nothing to address the underlying causes of this dysfunction. It actually would likely make matters worse by weakening congressional oversight of the executive, jacking even more decisions up to the leadership of both parties, and increasing our reliance on supplemental appropriations bills considered outside of the regular order. I want to stress, Mr. Chairman, that this same argument does not necessarily apply to multi-year budget agreements or to a two-year budget resolution of the sort that we just passed. My argument this morning applies to the 12 appropriations bills that must be passed under any budget agreement, regardless of its duration. Proponents of biennial budgeting claim they would free up Congress to conduct oversight in the off year. Now that is a supremely ironic claim. The most careful, most effective oversight Congress conducts is through the annual appropriations process, when an agency's performance and needs are reviewed program by program, line by line. Off-year oversight is less potent, not more potent, because it's further removed from actual funding decisions, reduces Congress's leverage. Now, supporters sometimes note that 4 recent presidents, George W. Bush, Bill Clinton, George H.W. Bush, and Ronald Reagan, all favored biennial appropriations. Does that really surprise anybody? If this suggests that this proposal is not a partisan issue, it certainly should warn us that it's an institutional issue. It should be obvious why presidents support a free pass every other year from an appropriations process that can make or break an administration's agenda. And by the way, they also support line item vetoes. They also support banning congressional earmarks. Of course, presidents support measures that are aimed at weakening Congress's authority vis-a-vis the executive branch. Now, it's often asserted that opponents of biennial budgeting are merely defenders of Appropriations Committee turf. Now, as a senior appropriator, I'm sensitive to those charges. My own view is that the annual work of appropriations serves this institution. It serves our place in the constitutional balance of power, and it does that no matter who is president and no matter what the balance of party control looks like. The appropriations process must be held accountable to Congress and the country, and here too I think biennial budgeting fails. Probably do more harm than good. Faced with outdated and unworkable funding levels for individual programs in the second year of a biennial appropriations, each federal department would be forced to present the Appropriations Committee with countless requests to reallocate, to reprogram their annual budgets. Now, you know how those requests are handled. They're denied or granted solely by the Appropriations Subcommittee chairman and ranking member without debate, without amendments, without votes, without public scrutiny. Off-year budget problems can't always be handled that way. That requires supplemental appropriations bill. And of course, biennial budgeting would produce many, many more supplemental appropriations bills. We already enact them when unforeseen emergency needs crop up. Budgeting 2 years in advance will only lead to a greater mismatch between the country's needs and agency budgets. In fact, the whole purpose of a biennial budget could be undermined by the proliferation of supplementals in the off years. So perversely, we would have replaced the deliberative and democratic process of annual appropriations with supplemental bills that are sporadic, rushed, and heavily controlled by leadership. So, Mr. Chairman, for reasons practical as well as institutional, biennial budgeting isn't any better idea today than it was 15 years ago. It would be a mistake to allow recent budget disagreements to lure us toward a supposed remedy that would make the appropriations process less systematic, less flexible, and less potent. And finally, just one comment on our current dilemmas. We all know the process has broken down, the budget process, the appropriations process. So we all have some obligation to acknowledge that and figure out how to remedy it. For years, we've passed ideologically based, unrealistic budget resolutions that make bipartisanship impossible. In fact, they virtually make appropriations impossible. This year, once again, it's only in the face of a government shutdown that we've revised the budget resolution so as to enable us to stitch together 12 appropriations bills into an omnibus bill that hopefully we can pass in December, 2.5 months into the fiscal year. And that's our best case scenario
Mr. Price,
currently.
wrap up.
I will wrap up. So biennial budgeting would fix none of this. Might well make it worse. What we got to do is muster the political will to make difficult and politically costly decisions, including a comprehensive budget plan that addresses the main drivers of our deficit, tax expenditures and entitlement spending. So I urge my colleagues to reject the siren call of biennial budgeting, to redouble our efforts to address the underlying causes of our long-term fiscal challenges. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the chance to offer these
Thank you.
thoughts.
Thank you. No, I appreciate the testimony of each and the work that each of you have done in this area for a significant length of time, and I want to commend Mr. Ribble for the work that he has done on this issue. I think that we all recognize the challenges that we have in the area of budgeting. Clearly, things aren't working as they should, as Mr. Ribble points out with his statistics. I would suggest, however, that the status quo is not what folks favor. I don't think, and I think Mr. Price would agree with that. But what we need to find is a way forward that allows us to have a more effective and more efficient and more accountable budgeting process. As we've talked about on our side, we're interested in a total rewrite of the '74 Act. 40 years since we've modified to any significant degree the way we budget around here, and clearly things have changed a lot in 40 years. So this committee has done a significant amount of work on trying to identify what it is that ought to be included in that rewrite. Sadly, we don't anticipate that this administration would be supportive of those kinds of things, and so our goal is to work with the next administration to have that, regardless of who that is, to have that enacted, hopefully into law in early 2017. So the current process needs reform. There's no doubt about that. The question is what should that reform look like? And I don't know that I'm agnostic on it, but about biennial budgeting. But I do have some significant concerns that I would like to raise and have addressed. Mr. Ribble, you outline a fairly persuasive argument as to why biennial budgeting ought to move forward. But let me mention 4 specific areas of concern, and I'd like you to address each of them. The first is the issue of reconciliation. Reconciliation is a tool used by the budget committees in the House and the Senate, regardless of the party in the majority, to provide a very potent opportunity to get legislation through both the House and the Senate and to the President's desk, and allows us to hold accountable the level of spending and to adjust the level of spending as the Congress at that point in time sees fit. It's my understanding that your bill would provide for reconciliation to only be allowed on a biannual basis as well, and it seems to me that removes an important tool for the Budget Committee and for Congress to be able to affect spending decisions on an annual basis. Second, I have a real concern that doing anything of this nature would significantly reduce the inertia for a comprehensive reform. Once you begin to take a little wind out of the sails of any significant reform, then we all know what happens around here, and that is people tend to back up and as opposed to lean into an issue and a challenge. Third, I am not persuaded that a biennial process reduces the possibility or even the probability of continuing resolutions. And my gut tells me that continuing resolutions of a longer duration, potentially 2 years, would be a step in the wrong direction. And I would love to have you address that. And then finally, Mr. Price's point about the lack of one of the major ways that we hold the executive branch accountable is through an appropriations process and accountability process on an annual basis, and some would argue that we need to do it more frequently as opposed to less frequently, and I would ask you to address that. So reconciliation, loss of inertia, CRs, and accountability of the executive branch.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll deal with reconciliation and CRs first. I think they're the simplest ones to deal with. First of all, I agree with the chairman's position. And I also profoundly agree with the system of regular order in this Congress. The Budget Committee has been given responsibility of oversight over the budget. And I would encourage you during a markup process to talk with those reforms with your colleagues here in the Budget Committee and amend the bill to have annual reconciliation or have a CR that can only go for X amount of months before it has to be moved. And you have all the power and jurisdiction with which to do that. And if you chose to modify the bill in that form, I certainly would not oppose it. Regarding accountability by having annual approach, it's an argument for a power unexercised in that we haven't done annual approach. And in fact, in 4 decades, we've only finished our annual appropriations process in their entirety 3 times. And so it'd be one thing if we were arguing for a power that's being regularly exercised and working, but we're arguing now for a power that's unexercised. And so I'm not quite sure that there's any power in something that we're not doing. And so, and the fact that Speaker Boehner and President Obama negotiated their own budget agreement this year for 2 years, and that prior to that, Ryan Murray agreement for 2 years, shows that the biennial idea is still a favorite approach, but it isn't a solution absent a better approach of actually doing appropriations on time. And like I mentioned before on reconciliation and CRs, and you'll have a chance to have another panel of budget experts talk about the benefit of having an annual approach system versus a biennial approach system. You also could possibly modify the bill to do annual appropriation with biennial budgeting, but I would encourage you, if you do that you put in an enforcement trigger for the Congress to make sure they do their work. A few years ago, during one of our debates on the debt limit, we passed a one-time, no budget, no pay. And like a miracle, for the first time in 4 years, the Senate passed a budget. It was like a miracle out of the sky, because Congress had an enforcement trigger. And I'm not advocating a no-pay system for getting our appropriations done, but I certainly would think it would be appropriate to say, if our appropriations are not done by date certain, we cannot recess until they're finished. And then you would interject into the system an enforcement method whereby those appropriations actually happen and the accountability you're seeking actually occurs. But absent that, there's no guarantee that we're going to have any improvement. And so that would be my answer, Mr. Chairman. I think they're really valid questions, and I appreciate you asking them.
The loss of inertia for major changes.
Oh, the loss of inertia. We've heard this argument repeatedly on a bunch of different things, and what I believe is that loss of inertia becomes a reason not to do anything. I've heard we shouldn't fix our tax code because we have to fix all the tax code. Well, tell that to taxpayers. They would like to have their problem fixed, absent a major tax reform bill. And I don't think we necessarily lose inertia. I actually think you gain inertia. If you can demonstrate to the American people that the Congress of the United States is moving forward, not only would our approval ratings go up, but inertia would be ingested into the system, and you would be able to do more forms more quickly. I think it would be the exact opposite of that, not
I appreciate addressing those issues. Let me touch on one new issue and then revisit something that you just said about the approach process. We've defaulted into a biennial budgeting process over the past couple of years, but I think the appropriators, and far be it from me to be a defender of the appropriators, but I think the appropriators would suggest that even their conversations and having the folks from the administration come to them on an annual basis within the current default system that we're in has held them to account. So are you suggesting that hasn't?
I think the Washington Post data would verify it. If we were truly holding them to account, we wouldn't have a $35 billion spike in spending in week 52.
I don't know that those two are associated, but I look forward to conversations about that. Let me revisit one final issue, and that is I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that the Budget Committee has done, on the House side, has done budgets every single year, save 2010, through both Republican and Democrat majorities. And one of the major challenges we've had is to get the Senate off the dime and to have them act. So
duly noted, Mr. Chairman. I agree with you.
Are you not with this focusing on the wrong potentially the wrong problem, and that is the problem is getting the Senate to act as opposed to budgeting over a 2-year period of time.
Not necessarily. I'm focusing on the Congress of the United States because it's all of us. It's easy for us to say, well, we did it, and kind of throw our hands up and act as if we're not accountable to the American people collectively as a Congress of the United States, because in fact we are. But we need to be working with our Senate colleagues to actually do the work that is necessary. But and by saying it's just the Senate, and I recognize that the House has done its work in this regard, it really doesn't address the issue of the fact that we're not getting reconciled budgets in election years at all. And that's one of the political concerns that I have that I think could be fixed with this.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you both for your thoughtful presentations this morning. Let me just ask you, Mr. Ribble, apart from the biannual budgeting component, you've got a provision in here that changes the functional categories of the budget that are presented. When we're dealing with this in front of the Budget Committee, you collapse about 12 different functions down to 5. Is that something that you feel is essential to this bill? And
no, I don't feel it's essential, Mr. Van Hollen. I do believe that streamlining can be an effective tool for actually getting the work done. Again, like I mentioned to Chairman Price, that I'm well aware of the committee's jurisdiction over this piece of legislation. And I would encourage during the markup process to have a robust debate about that element of the bill, and to deal with the collective wisdom of the great crowd of the Budget Committee in both parties to find the reforms to the bill that would make it not only palatable to the members of this committee, but also to make it the best possible process that you can get out of it. And I think that's what markups are for. And I tried, along with my colleagues, Mr. Pocan, Mr. Schrader, Mr. Rokita, and others, former Chairman Paul Ryan, to thread the needle on these things, recognizing yet that the committee will do its work when it gets to markup.
Thank you. And I noticed a number of those members you've mentioned are from Wisconsin, which is one of the 19 states that I think still has biannual budgeting.
Yeah.
I do think it's interesting to note for members of the committee that most states that once had biannual budgeting have moved over now to annual budgeting. And I don't want to get in a big debate, but it is an observation that it seems to me may have some bearing on here. There were 44 states that had biannual budgeting in 1940. Today there are 19. So at least at the state level, whether they were good or bad reasons, the reality is a lot have...
Might have mentioned that to you, Mr. Van Hollen. Sure. Just to respond to it briefly. I think also if you do a deeper dive on the data on those states that have moved away from biennial, you'll find other causes for the movement, like going to either a full-time legislative body from a part-time, or from a part-time to a full-time, that when they did this big reform in light of Mr. Chairman's conversation on inertia, they've made big, broad changes in how they governed themselves, and these were part of those changes. And so it's more causal to those reforms as it is necessarily to the actual biennial approach.
Fair enough. I know in Maryland, where we have a very powerful executive budget, if we didn't go through some kind of annual process, the legislative body would have very little impact on the decisions.
We'd welcome your move to Green Bay.
And I appreciate, Mr. Price, you're drawing the distinction between the 2-year budget agreement that we reached in Ryan Murray, as well as the more recent one compared to a 2-year appropriations process. I do think, especially in light of the sequester and all the battles around that, setting the overall levels of defense discretionary spending and non-defense discretionary spending takes out of the political process a big disagreement in the party. So I think that has provided stability. But that doesn't mean that we should translate that same pattern to the annual appropriations, because it's a question of, as Mr. Price said, whether the annual process actually provides for more scrutiny at the end of the day and more oversight, and whether more oversight actually brings more accountability on behalf of the executive branch. And look, these are all issues that, are close calls. They're all judgment calls. The chairman actually raised a number of the issues that I have, so I'm not going to sort of retread that territory. But I would ask the question, when you've got a new president coming in, biannual budgeting would, of course, require a new president to, within a very short period of time, lay out their 2-year appropriations agenda. Not just their overall budget categories and numbers, but their appropriations agenda. And it does seem to me that from a national perspective, forcing that sort of rapid decision-making will either lead to locking in, priorities that could change very rapidly, or, simply going back the next year with a lot of supplemental and changes, which at the end of the day amounts to the same as an annual appropriations process. Could you both comment on that?
You want to? Go ahead. Okay. I would just say to that, it's counter to the argument that Mr. Price made a moment ago regarding presidents supporting this idea. But I think when we look at it at a practical matter, when it comes to appropriations for, let's say, Department of Commerce or Department of Education, an incoming president is heavily reliant on those career politicians, not career bureaucrats that are working in those departments and have worked in those departments in many cases for decades to advise and provide information. You also have the historical context there of what spending has looked like over the last decade or decades. And so I don't see it as a big hurdle. It's in its most basic form, it's arithmetic, and not really all that complex arithmetic, quite frankly. And so I don't see it as much of a hurdle, to be honest with you.
I believe it would be a considerable hurdle. And I think the problematic aspects of biennial appropriations would be especially acute in the first year of a new presidential administration for the reasons that you're implying. By the way, I'm impressed with Mr. Ribble's proposal here and the kind of homework that he's done and the kind of openness he's expressed to some kind of combination of a multi-year projection of budget numbers, maybe even agreement on budget numbers longer term, and then an annual appropriations process that digs down every year within those parameters and holds the executive accountable and writes detailed budgets. That may be where this process should end up. I do think we would lose a great deal, though, by having a 2-year appropriations cycle, and the problems would be especially acute in the first year of a new administration because the president who comes in is inevitably dependent on the work that's gone before. The presidential budgets in the first year are typically pretty skeletal. They're of course late in getting fleshed out. The appropriations process has some particular need, I think, to do the best we can in that first year. But then in the second year of that cycle, appropriations becomes much more detailed, much more keyed to the budget of the new administration. A lot of that does await year 2. So you'd lose a great deal, I think, by having to scramble in the first few months and presume to do appropriations for the next 2 years.
Thank you. I want to thank Mr. Ribble and Mr. Price for appearing before us today. Please be advised that members may submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and your answers will be made part of the formal hearing record. Any member who wishes to submit questions for the record may do so within 7 days. And we appreciate your attendance today and wish you a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're now prepared to hear from our second panel of witnesses, and I would like to ask them to come to the witness table, please. I'd like to welcome our second panel, Dr. Rivlin, Dr. Penner, and Dr. Joyce. We want to thank you for your time today. The committee has received your written statements, and without objection, they will be made part of the formal hearing record. You will each have 5 minutes to deliver your oral remarks. There aren't many individuals who think that budget process reform is an exciting endeavor. However, this chairman does, and so I want to thank you for your passion about these issues and trying to get this right. So, Dr. Rivlin, you may begin when you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm delighted to be back in this hearing room with one of my two favorite committees over the years. Let me start by agreeing with what many have said. No process can make budget decisions easy. They're just inherently hard. But the process we are now working with has broken down. It's been replaced by ad hoc workarounds, and Congress is able to ignore long-term fiscal responsibility. So a new process is needed. Former Senate Budget Chairman Pete Domenici and I recently completed a proposal for improving the congressional budget process, which is quite comprehensive and which is attached to my testimony. It has three major themes: that the budget process should include all federal spending and revenues. It should not leave entitlements or tax expenditures on automatic pilot, but subject them to periodic review and decision-making. Second, the budget process should be transparent and completed on time. Third, the budget process should have buy-in from the President and from the leadership of Congress. I believe that biennial budgeting is an important first step toward broader budget process reform, and I strongly support Congressman Ribble's bill. If the Congress passed a biennial budget resolution in the first year of each Congress and appropriations for two upcoming fiscal years, it would be easier for the executive branch agencies to plan ahead and to use resources wisely. It would also be easier for the Congress to make significant changes in spending, either positive or negative, with a 2-year time horizon. Program managers would be able to spend less time defending their budgets and more time running their programs. Congressional committees, including this one, would spend less time reviewing budgets and more time overseeing how effectively the money is spent. Unforeseen events or genuine emergencies would, of course, arise, as they do now, and would have to be dealt with by supplemental appropriations or contingency funding. But this does not seem to me to be a major problem, nor does the necessity of projecting economic assumptions an extra year in advance. In truth, Congress has already migrated toward 2-year budgeting by effectively setting caps on discretionary spending for 2 consecutive years, most recently in the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2015. But appropriations, whether annual or biennial, cover only about 1/3 of total federal spending and are not the source of the future growth in spending that is projected to occur as the population ages and health care costs continue to rise. The greatest weakness in the current process is that the major entitlements, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, are effectively outside the budget process. Spending for these programs continues automatically without triggering any congressional action, as does the massive amount of spending that occurs in the tax code. If Congress is to take deliberate actions necessary to control rising future debt, it must include all spending, including tax expenditures, and all revenue in the budget process. Congress should set targets for the major entitlement programs and tax expenditures and establish a schedule of periodic review and decision-making to make sure the targets are either met or deliberately adjusted. Finally, the budget process is the forum in which differences between the branches must be addressed, debated, and resolved. It requires the active participation of the executive and legislative branch leadership. To this end, the Budget Committee should be transformed into leadership committees. Their membership should include the chairs and ranking members of the major fiscal, tax, and economic committees. Presidential buy-in is also required, either by making the biennial budget resolution into a law or a joint resolution to be signed by the president or in some other way. In conclusion, I commend the House Budget Committee and Congressman Ribble for making budget process a priority. Biennial budgeting seems to me a good first step, but only a part of what needs to be done. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you so much. Dr. Penner, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Van Hollen, and other members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on biennial budgeting. I'll focus my remarks on the variant of biennial budgeting in which both the budget resolution and appropriations would be considered every other year. I believe that biennial budgeting of this sort would create several problems. Things change significantly from year to year, and that makes it important to examine budget decisions annually. Changes would not be a problem if they could be forecast, but although budget forecasts are made by very able, hardworking people, they frequently go astray, sometimes badly astray. Indeed, all forecasters err often, whether the forecaster is trying to predict the weather, earthquakes, or the outcome of elections. A number of years ago, I examined the accuracy of Congressional Budget Office revenue forecasts. I certainly didn't mean to criticize CBO. The results would have been similar for any forecasting group. Perhaps unfortunately for CBO, it's very transparent about its forecasting errors, and that makes its errors easy to study. The most important CBO revenue forecast is usually put together in January for the fiscal year that begins the following October 1st. It serves as a basis for the budget resolution. The average absolute forecasting error for the period 84 to 2005 was 0.8% of GDP. That equals approximately $140 billion at the level of fiscal 2015 GDP. That error amounts to that error amounts to almost 1/3 of the actual 2015 deficit and somewhat more than 4% of 2015 revenues. I believe that errors that large imply that the Congress should not wait 2 years before considering a new budget resolution. And of course, I'm talking about an average error. Frequently, mistakes are very much larger. The largest error made in that period was for the January 2001 forecast for fiscal 2002. It equaled 3.2% of GDP, or about $570 billion at current levels of GDP. Forecasts of how individual programs will evolve can also be horribly misguided. The need for a particular program can go up or down unexpectedly. There can be cost overruns or, less frequently, unanticipated savings. And the costs of materials and personnel are always difficult to predict. If appropriations were done only every 2 years, it is likely there would be a demand for numerous supplementals during the off year, and supplementals are much more difficult to discipline than regular appropriations. Many favor biennial budgeting because it's supposed to free up more time for the oversight of programs. I have my doubts. The Budget and Employment Control Act of 1974 moved the beginning of the fiscal year from July 1 to October 1 in order to give appropriations committees more time to complete their tasks. On-time performance has deteriorated markedly since that reform was implemented. I fear that if we went to biennial budgeting, the appropriation process could take 2 years to complete 2-year appropriations. Moreover, it was my personal experience working at CBO and in the executive branch that the most intense scrutiny of programs where I had some responsibility came in the annual appropriations process. Moving to a 2-year budget might reduce rather than intensify that kind of oversight. There's another problem with biennial budgeting. Budgeting is one of the most complicated tasks performed by humans. If time were unlimited, each government activity should be traded off against every other government activity and against different levels of taxation and the deficit. But that would imply examining many millions of trade-offs. Even if we could forecast perfectly, that would be a Herculean task, and obviously time is not unlimited. The best we can do each year is to focus on a small portion of the entire universe of possible issues. That turns budgeting into an iterative process. Perfection is never attained, but each step represents an opportunity to improve the allocation of resources. That is why we should take a step every year instead of every 2 years, and Mr. Chairman, that step could involve reconciliation. It is also true that the political chances for improving our unsustainable fiscal situation vary up and down over the years. It would be a great tragedy if one of the best chances occurred in an off year of a 2-year cycle. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Joyce, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Pascrell, and members of the Budget Committee for inviting me to share my views on proposals to create a biennial budget process for the federal government. I've actually lost count of the number of testimonies I have written on biennial budgeting over the last 25 years, going back to the time when I was an analyst at CBO and I used to write them for other people. But most of the arguments pro and con have not changed much over the last 25 years, and my own bottom line is this. I'm sympathetic to the goals of those who advocate biennial budgeting, but I'm skeptical that these positive effects will actually be realized. And given this, the concerns that I will raise about the possible negative consequences suggest to me that, on the margin, the costs of biennial budgeting may well outweigh the benefits. I understand, given the current state of the budget process, why people argue that the world might be a better place with less time spent on budgeting and more on authorization and oversight if we only budgeted half as often. But I'm afraid that a biennial budget process on paper will become an annual process in fact. Budgeting for a $4 trillion enterprise is an inherently uncertain and complex endeavor. I think it's instructive, as Mr. Van Hollen pointed out, that the states with the largest budgets do not, for the most part, budget biennially. For a government as complex as the federal government, I think the further out that we try to budget, the more likely it is that changes will be necessary in what we are calling the non-budget year. And not just a few changes, but a lot of changes. Also, it seems unlikely that appropriators, and especially House appropriators who don't sit on other committees, would decide to just take every other year off. Given the decrease in time, given this, any decrease in time spent on budgeting and increase in predictability might be illusory. What about the argument that oversight would improve? I don't think the main problem with the lack of oversight or the quality of oversight has to do with time. I believe, conversely, the reason that more and better authorizing and oversight do not occur has to do with a lack of incentives to do so. Frankly, the hard work of doing detailed performance-focused reviews of federal agencies has few obvious electoral benefits. And there is substantial oversight, as it has been pointed out, that takes place as a part of the appropriations process, and in that sense, I think a biennial process might actually decrease oversight. So far, I've focused on the advertised benefits of biennial budgeting, but I think the reform might have some negative consequences as well. I certainly agree with Dr. Penner's testimony concerning the potential of the reform to increase reliance on outdated projections, but I'd like to focus on a couple other potential negative effects. First, I fear, along with you, Mr. Chairman, when your comments to the previous witnesses, that a biennial process will compromise the ability of Congress to set overall fiscal policy. As this committee knows, it's mandatory spending and tax expenditures that are the ticking time bombs in the federal budget. And historically, it is the budget resolutions reconciliation process that has been used to try to force changes to those programs. A biennial process would only require the Congress to confront our current imbalance every other year. Personally, I think as long as the federal budget is on its current unsustainable trajectory, the Congress, and the President for that matter, should be forced to confront fiscal policy every year. And by the way, as Dr. Penner suggested, there's no guarantee that the next time the political stars align in favor of debt reduction, it will be in an odd-numbered year. If we really did budget for most programs and policies every 2 years, this could also make it more difficult to change priorities. I think the conversation earlier about what would happen when we have a new president is actually a very important one, because a new president comes into office, has to present a budget usually within 2 or 3 months that's been put together relatively quickly, Under a biennial process, it would then not be until after the congressional midterm elections that a president would have another opportunity to present a full budget. A biennial process might also delay the ability of the Congress to reduce or eliminate funding for programs that were no longer working. That is, it would freeze priorities in place. So I think biennial budgeting could result in less direct accountability to the electorate, especially because the budget would only be enacted in non-election years. So in closing, I'm sympathetic to all the criticisms of the current process that lead thoughtful people to support biennial budgets. The budget process is not timely, it does not promote predictability, it is time-consuming, and not enough time is spent on oversight. I do question, however, whether biennial budgeting is the solution to these problems, and I'm concerned that the reform may make it more difficult for the Congress and the President to deal with the large fiscal and policy problems that the country faces. Thanks for your attention. I'd be happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Dr. Joyce. I want to thank all of you for your testimony. We'll now move to the question and answer period for this panel, and I recognize the Vice Chairman, Mr. Rokita from Indiana, for 5 minutes.
I thank the Chairman, and thanks for putting together this panel and this hearing. I want to thank the witnesses for their testimony. Starting with you, Dr. Rivlin, welcome back.
Thank you.
Always good to have you. It's good to have all of you. Could you react to Dr. Joyce's last couple comments? Yes, the current process is broken, but we're not sure biennial budgeting is the solution, and we still need to have oversight. And in an election year, we might lose accountability to the voter, especially in light of the fact that we end up doing these omnibuses and cromnibuses and all in election years anyway to keep the government going. If you believe Mr. Ribble's testimony, can you react to that, Dr. Rivlin?
Well, I certainly agree with Professor Joyce and with everybody who's spoken that the current process is badly broken. I don't think two-year budgeting and appropriations is a panacea. In fact, as I said in my testimony, it doesn't deal really with the fact that appropriations are only about a third of spending. So it doesn't go as far as I would like. But I'm not so persuaded as both Dr. Penner and Dr. Joyce are that biennial budgeting would limit the oversight because I think the appropriators tend to think they'd have less power if they were appropriating for 2 years. I think they'd have more, that you can make bigger changes if you're not doing a rushed budget for a year that's already started, which is what we normally do, and you can make bigger changes over a 2-year period. I think that would happen for the president as well. But realistically, much of what appropriators do is not related to current events. It is the nitty-gritty of looking at particular programs which mostly tend to survive, and I think they tend to survive often because there's a big rush to get the annual appropriations done, and you're not making, you don't feel comfortable making a big decision to say, we need to zero out this program or reduce it and increase something else. So I'm just not as worried as they are that this would be restrictive.
Thank you, Dr. Rivlin. In full disclosure, I come from a state that has biennial budgeting, and then I used to be a statewide office holder that ran 4 agencies, and it was made to know 2 years ahead of time what I needed and what I didn't, live under that. So that's the framework I come from on this.
I'm a fellow Hoosier, so maybe that's where I got it.
Yeah, great minds, right? Common sense. Dr. Penner, can you comment on whether or not, we have this holy grail we try to get to called a balanced budget. Does biennial budgeting help or hurt us achieving that goal, do you think?
Well, I've long thought, sir, that budget process does not necessarily lead to a particular solution, nor should it. It should be fairly neutral in terms of the size of government, size of deficits, and so forth. I think the difficulty of getting to balanced budget really has very little to do with process. It really has mainly to do with the difficult politics of the chore.
We have to put our big boy pants on and make tough decisions, regardless of the process.
Very definitely. That does not mean I'm opposed to budget process reform. Absolutely not. I think there are a very large number of things that can be done to the process to improve it. And the most important thing to keep your eye on in reforming the process is to please make it much more simple than it is today.
It's needlessly more difficult than it has to be.
I think so. Now, there are reasons for the complexity. A lot of the complexity comes from the efforts to prevent the Congress from gaming the budget. And still, a lot of gaming goes on. But a lot of the points of order and so forth are directed at that goal. I would prefer to accept a little gaming in order to get to a process that was more easily understood.
And my time's expired. I apologize, Dr. Joyce. I must yield back. Thank you all.
Thank the gentleman. Gentleman from Washington State is recognized. Dr. McDermott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the three of you willing to come and be a part of this today. For 45 years, I've been on budget committees and Ways and Means committees in the state legislature and here in the Congress. And it's amazing. These ideas come and go, and the one gets put in and then one gets then taken out, and it never changes the process because basically it's a political process, how you allocate money. 1980, I was the Ways and Means chairman in the state legislature when Ronald Reagan came in with no new taxes all over his lips, and I had three guys in the Senate who would not vote for taxes. So we had a deadlock. The Republicans finally had to come to the Democrats and ask for some votes. The Reagan budgets threw us into such turmoil. We lost $500 million. We had to pass a $250 million balance to just bridge the gap. We had a balanced budget amendment, by the way. Our state requires a balanced budget. So we had 4 special sessions where we raised the sales tax 0.1%. And 3 months later, we came in and raised it 0.1% again. I kept saying to the Republicans, God, you guys, why don't you raise it a half a penny and get it so we don't be in here every 3 months? That was the nature, and you never know what that's going to happen. Well, the federal level, I mean, if we passed a biennial budget before 9/11, or if we'd passed a biennial budget before the collapse of the Bush administration, and Henry Paulson was in here with his hair on fire telling us we had to pass $700 billion to bail out the banks. What does that do to a budget process? There's no one who sits here or sits here that can ever predict what's going to have to be out there. One of the reforms I made, which you don't have here in the federal government, was I finally got the Republicans and the Democrats and the governor to agree to one person to give us a revenue estimate for the next 2 years. We hired an economist by the name of Chung Muk Chung, and everybody came to call him Dr. Gloom, because every December he would give 3 offers. He'd give a high rate and a minimum rate, medium rate, and a minimum rate. And the legislature and the governor had to stay with the same revenue estimates. In this place, half our problems become because OMB says one thing and the CBO says something else about what the revenue is. I mean, we find a million ways to do this. Doing it biennially, I think, I mean, from my own experience of having been 17 years under it in the state legislature and being up here under the annual, it really doesn't make any difference what kind of budget process you have if you have one group of people who say, we will not increase revenue. Our problem right now is that we got a bunch of people who will not raise revenue for anything unless they can find some way to make it look like it isn't revenue raising. That's Kabuki Theater. And I do not see the oversight question. The gentleman from Indiana says he had oversight. Well, yeah, we had oversight, but we were part-time legislators. We weren't spending all our time. You've got a Congress that is here full-time and could do all the oversight they wanted to, except they don't want to spend any time in Washington. The legislative schedule designed by the Republicans is to get us out of town. So we're never here. So what you have here today is 6 people willing to sit through this hearing, even to talk about the issue. There's no interest in fixing it to make it work unless it works my way only. And I really despair. I appreciate your coming up here and talking, and really your honest, your questions about what will happen. I've seen them all happen in Washington State. So if they want to bring it here to the United States Congress, bring it here. We'll still find people who can work their way around the budget process. We had a supplemental budget every single year I was in the state legislature, and we will have one here. And it won't be controlled by anybody except the leadership.
Thank you, sir. Gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Garrett, is recognized for 5 minutes.
On that optimistic note, so if you look at this from a constitutional perspective, and forgive me, I was with another hearing, so maybe somebody looked at this from all the constitutional perspective. You know, Madison described the Constitution entrusts Congress with one of the most essential powers, which is the power of the purse. Described it as the power of the purse and the growth of representative government, power of the purse by the legislature, the closest branch to the people. This is our way to potentially protect ourselves or restrict the executive powers and resources, and that's what the Founding Fathers were thinking about. So the question then does biennial budgeting change that? And apparently it does, at least in studies or looked at, according to Paul Kearns of Michigan State, paper in '94, a biennial budget might shift the balance of power from the legislature to the executive, because he basically has control now for the next 23 and a half months on that. And he has the ability to address those needs that everyone around the table here is addressing that may change over time, whether it's a war, an incursion, or whatever else that we just cannot anticipate. So that's one of the fundamental constitutional questions that I see here. And maybe the founders also anticipated not or hoped for a government that was not ever expanding in size. And part of another study out of University of Michigan in '03 found that states that with biennial budgets tend to spend about $119 more per capita than states with annual budgets. So if that's with those two principles, does anyone want to just chime in briefly on that before I get to the next points? Joyce?
Go
Go ahead.
I just wanted to say that I think that one can decide whether one is comfortable with a reform that gives more power to the executive or not, and there are perfectly reasonable arguments to be made on both sides. But I think, as you suggest, we should not kill ourselves into thinking that biennial budgeting does not do that. I think biennial budgeting, because it doesn't give as much of an opportunity for the Congress to respond by setting its own fiscal policy by having an annual budget resolution
So that's
process.
an interesting point then. So we've seen over the last half a dozen years an executive grow in power and Congress recede in power, and I know this is changes over the history of Congress, sometimes strong presidents, sometimes weak presidents. But by doing this, we would basically, what you're saying is making the statement, we are hereby seceding some of our power, giving up some of our power to the executive. And if you look back to some of the stats on this, states, you know, the Laboratory of Experimentation understood this as well back in, I don't know if you had these numbers before, 44 states had this back in 1940, and today, only 19 states do, and since '68, 15 states have transitioned from biennial budgeting to annual budgeting. Conversely, only 3 states have gone in the other way. So the Laboratories of Experimentation says, let's look at this for all the great reasons that the proponents think that it's going to work. They've looked at it, they examined it, they explored it, they used it, and they realized it didn't work for a myriad of reasons. And so I think we have to be long and hard on that. Your comment was, one of the benefits of it was that maybe we can do the big things in this manner. Make the bigger changes over a 2-year period. That sort of begs the question whether those big things that we will be changing either A, are going to spend more money, which I guess is what the data shows, those in the states that have done it, and B, why aren't we making those big changes now? I agree with the gentleman from the other side of the aisle that perhaps the reason we're not making those big changes is not because of some budgetary issue, whoever's sitting in the chair handling the budget committee, it is more a political issue that we're not making those big changes. Wouldn't you agree it's really more, as Mr. McDermott raises, that it's more political that we're not making fundamental changes as opposed to some arcane budget rules? So
Oh, yes, I stipulated that at the very beginning of my testimony. I don't think that process changes are going to give the Congress the courage to face up to big decisions. That's more, that is politics.
Yeah, so then would you add that to the facts that someone else said, maybe you too as well, that we're not really good at budgetary forecasts. We always disagree as to what the numbers are. We're really not good at budgeting, forecasting out 24 months from now. Heck, we can't figure these numbers out 12 months from now. You have all this going against it. I'm not seeing much at all in favor going in favor of this.
Well, I do think that most of what goes on in appropriations committees is not related to forecasts. It is very time-consuming, going through line by line, and I think that inhibits thinking about how do you want to move money around, because you can't really in a very short time period. You could more easily in a 2-year time frame. And as to catastrophes, Congressman McDermott cited the recent financial crash. Clearly, things like that are going to require supplementals. War is going to require that. That's true now. It's independent of how long the budget process is.
Right. Gentleman's time has expired. The other gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pascrell, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I want to commend Congressman Ribble particularly because I don't agree with his conclusion, but he's done a heck of a lot of research and knows what he's talking about. I can't agree with his conclusion in terms of cause and effect, but he makes a lot of sense. If there was some way to modify his conclusion, I think, and to try to interject into the process that exists right now, as convoluted as it is, I think we might have something here. So I don't think time is the core issue here. I think the core issue is product and efficiency. I agree with my colleague from New Jersey, Mr. Garrett. Relax. On this issue, about the growing executive power. And I would say, getting into the meat and potatoes here, I would say before that, I think that we are all culpable over the last 12 years particularly about where the Constitution begins and ends on separation of power. I think we need to review that, Mr. Chairman. In the past 4 years, we've had 2 government shutdowns. It cost us billions of dollars, it hurt a lot of jobs, and it hurt economic growth. Some say that reducing the number of budget showdowns would help prevent situations like this. I understand that. But, Mr. Chairman, these shutdown crises were, I think, self-inflicted and not the result of a poor budget process, but of a complete breakdown in the system here. When the budget process, whatever way, shape, or form it takes, is hijacked by few members who have some kind of extreme demands, we continue to face the threat of shutdowns. We will continue this governing by crisis. I don't see how biennial budget is going to avoid that. I don't. We need to be able to adapt to changing circumstances and be nimble enough to match the particular funding needs of each agency on an annual basis. Predicting 2 years out when inflation will be and what our needs will be would certainly mean relying more and more on supplemental funding bills. I think that this is as ridiculous as both parties have fallen into the trap of a 5-year consternation and a 10-year consternation. How the hell do we know what's going to happen in 2 years from now or 5 years from now? But we have these budget projections that go out. And many times they're not accurate, but it's done because it makes it look good, what we're doing at that particular time. We can't anticipate every recession. We can't anticipate every emergency. It may require a redirection of resources. In all of these cases, Congress would still have to debate and argue over authorization levels. So I think we're trying to abdicate our responsibility in moving in that conclusion, as well-intended as it is. Dr. Penner, do you think our disagreements about the size and reach of government will be affected or in any way diminished by moving to a biennial budgeting process, in your estimation?
I really think they're completely separate issues, sir. I can't really, except for the one point that I made, and that is that I think we should take the chance to improve the budget as often as we can. Right. And as a practical matter, I think that is once a year. So in that sense, if we really take the opportunity to improve the budget, annual budgeting is a better idea.
Doctor, does biennial budgeting make it more or less likely that Congress would have to pass a supplemental or emergency spending bills to address some unforeseen circumstances in the 2-year window we're talking about?
Well, I think it very obvious that it would require more supplementals. And I have to say, when I worked at OMB, we shuddered whenever supplementals came up because
Can you say that again, please?
I say when I worked at OMB,
Right.
we shuddered whenever supplementals came up because they are difficult to discipline. Things can get introduced into them that have nothing to do with the need to change because of uncertainty.
Thank you, Doctor.
Gentleman's
Thank you,
time
Mr.
has
Chairman.
expired. Thank you,
Goodbye.
sir. Thank you. The gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Grothman, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thanks for calling on me. I'm on this bill because I was in a state legislature where we did biennial budgeting, and I guess I signed on it maybe out of desperation because it would be almost inconceivable that anything would make it worse than it is right now, right? Almost inconceivable. But I'll give you a question, which is maybe off point. Maybe I shouldn't ask something off point. As you sit in this committee, you have to think, if not biennial budget, what will change things? And, you know, when I leave here, I'm going to go to a conference committee with, it's just, it's not an appropriation, it's just a recommendation for a massive increase in education spending. In the next few weeks, we're going to vote on something with a massive increase in transit spending. So it seems this place is broken because you'd figure given the huge deficit, everybody in this building would come with the idea that we have to cut spending, not go up. But it seems to be the opposite. I think part of the problem in both cases is this idea in the Senate you need 60 votes. And the more votes you need, the more likely you're going to get those votes by spending more money somewhere. So you reach a compromise to get up to 60 by spending more and more. I'd like Dr. Rivlin to comment on the idea that maybe if you went to 50 votes in the Senate solely for spending bills, it would be easier to pass something without these massive spending increases that the current process has.
I actually agree with that. I think that the supermajority is not helpful, that majority rule is better. We've got, and that is, of course, the argument for reconciliation, that there you do have majority rule in the Senate. I think that's not, well, leave it there.
Okay, Dr. Penner, do you think if we went from 60 to 50 votes, it would be easier to pass a budget without these massive spending increases?
Well, I think it'd be easier to pass a budget of any kind, sir, whether with or without spending increase. And I tend to agree with my colleague that a 50-vote requirement is much better than a supermajority. And as she said, that's what we have under reconciliation.
Right, so you go to 55, you go to 60, you just go to 65. Whenever you need more votes, you just have to buy those votes by piling on more that something of which somebody wants. Dr. Joyce, what do you think about going 50 votes instead of 60 on the annual budget?
Well, I think it's undoubtedly true. There's no question that you are correct, that the more votes you need, the more you're going to have to make more people happy, and that certainly has implications. I would add to that your question, which is really about more fundamental reform, I mean, I think that is something that's worth thinking about, which is, it's been a long time. As far as I know, 1993 was the last time the Congress actually took a serious look at comprehensive organization of the Congress, and there's a lot of issues around comprehensive organization of the Congress that really go far beyond the budget process and way beyond biennial budgeting.
Okay, well, thank you, and just respond a little to my good friend, Mr. McDermott over there. I have a feeling that there were other people in the Washington legislature who felt that the problem in the Washington legislature where there's some stubborn holdouts who refuse to say no to new spending, but just the other side of the story. Thank you for calling on me.
Thank you, Mr. Grothman. Gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Yarmouth, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to the witnesses. I apologize for missing your prepared testimony. I was at a markup in another building, but I did have the chance to scan it. And I'm a co-sponsor of the Ribble bill. The reason I was attracted to the concept of biennial budgeting primarily is because I deal every day with people, agencies, local nonprofits, whatever it may be, who complain to me about uncertainty and how impossible it is to plan year to year. And you, Dr. Joyce, you referenced that, you discussed that slightly in terms of the agencies, but not the people on the ground who use it. And I understand that even if there would still be a degree of uncertainty if you went to biennial budgeting, but whether you're a housing program or a social service program or so forth. But I think you all were here to hear Mr. Ribble and Mr. Price, and the question came up about whether or not it would be feasible to do a biennial budget process and an annual appropriations process. Now, that wouldn't serve the certainty issue or the uncertainty issue with the ultimate recipients of grants and so forth. And I know, Ms. Rivlin, you talked about that as well, Dr. Rivlin, you talked about a biennial appropriations process. Would it make sense to do something like that, if you went to a biennial budgeting process, to do an annual appropriations process, or does that undermine the biennial budgeting process? You can both respond.
I think it loses most of the advantage of the biennial process. I see most of the advantage, as you do, in creating more certainty for the agencies and for their clients. I think it also gives the Congress more opportunity to make major changes or even minor changes because you have a 2-year horizon to do that in the appropriations process.
If I could comment,
Yes, Dr. Henning.
I think really the most important thing you can do to increase certainty is to start passing appropriations bills on time.
Dr. Joyce.
That's exactly what I was going to say. That would be far more important, but I do think there is a concern that because the stakes would be so much higher with a 2-year appropriation, that it actually might, on the margin, be more difficult to pass a 2-year appropriation than a 1-year appropriation. But I'm for anything that creates more certainty for agencies and recipients of federal funds.
One other thing that it kind of relates to budgeting, but it really doesn't in terms of whether you have a 1-year budget or a 2-year budget. But one of the things that I'm trying to get a grasp on continuously is how Congress makes policy. When we move at optimum efficiency at 10 miles an hour and the world's moving at 100 miles an hour. And whether it's the energy field or the transportation field or education or healthcare, whatever it is, things are moving so rapidly and changing so rapidly that we have making policy where we're not where we're thinking as if we're acting as if nothing's changing is something that I think is really impeding our ability to make rational policy decisions. I don't know if 2 years would change that perspective. I doubt if it would change it much. But is there any way? Do you think that the 2-year budgeting process would actually force us to look a little bit further into the future than we do now?
I think it would help, but rather marginally. The things that you are talking about are true. You would give you a little more time to think about them, but really you need to think about things on a 5 and 10-year horizon. I need to come back to my favorite theme, which is you aren't thinking about the entitlements and the revenues on a longer time horizon. And we do know something about what's going to happen to spending in healthcare, for instance. It's going up, and you're not coping with it.
Thank you. If anybody else wants to respond to that, otherwise I yield back. Do you want to respond? Then I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much.
Thank the gentleman. I yield myself 5 minutes for questions, purpose questions. We're all prisoners of our experience. I spent 8 years at the Georgia State Legislature, where we do not only an annual budget, but we do an annual supplemental. And we do all of that within a 40-day period of time. So the work can get done when the timelines are well defined, and it works relatively well. But we at the state level have felt the importance of a mid-course correction every fiscal year. Our fiscal year begins at July 1 in the state of Georgia. Appreciate all of the testimony. Dr. Rivlin, I particularly appreciate you highlighting the danger of automatic spending and us not addressing it. And I guess if I thought that a trade-off to 2-year budgeting would allow us to bring tax extenders and the automatic spending in Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security on budget, if you will, boy, oh boy, that'd be something I might be able to jump up and down about, because I think that we're not addressing the long-term spending challenges that we have because they're on the automatic side. This committee has started a program or a project called Restoring the Trust for All Generations to try to build that critical mass of the American people and our colleagues who need to appreciate and then act upon the importance of saving and strengthening and securing those programs, as opposed to sticking our head in the sand, which is what we have tended to do at this point. I think that the question that I had, Dr. Rivlin, was that you mentioned that the amount of time is not, with 1 year, it seems not to be enough for the Appropriations Committee to get their work done by the time that the fiscal year begins. I just have trouble trying to rationalize or account for why would it make any difference if they're trying to do 2 years worth of work in 6 months as opposed to 1 year's worth of work in 6 months? What changes?
Well, it's going to be difficult in any case, but I believe you need to sanction yourself in some way. Senator Domenici and I suggested if you don't get it done, you don't get a recess. That's a little gimmicky, but it's not such a crazy idea. Something bad needs to happen if you don't get the work on time.
In fact, some trigger mechanism.
Yeah.
Congressman Ribble actually mentioned that in his testimony.
Yeah.
My partner on the other side of the Capitol, Senator Enzi, the chairman of the Senate Budget Committee, has a modification of this of a biennial budgeting proposal, and I would wonder if each of you might comment on his, which, as I understand it, is to believing that the amount of time is not enough to do all 12 appropriations bills. It would be to have 6 appropriations bills done 1 year and 6 in the alternate year, and that might allow us more opportunity to do both oversight but also get the work done, and wonder what each of you might think of that. Dr. Rivlin?
It has an attractive aspect, which is it would allow more thought for some programs in 1 year and the other in the other. I'm not certain that's workable, because you do need the whole budget done at some point.
Dr. Penner?
I would not favor such an idea because it seems to me you want to look at the budget as a whole. The essence of budgeting is to make trade-offs. They may be between different bills, and it'd be very difficult to do that if you were doing them alternatively year by year. Just to comment on the other point about the difficulty of controlling long-run entitlements and tax expenditures, there is absolutely nothing in the idea of annual budgeting that prevents you from setting long-run goals for other programs and perhaps building artificial trigger mechanisms or other mechanisms into them to control spending in the long run.
The former, as you know, we did in our budget this past year with agreement between the House and the Senate. Dr. Joyce?
I agree that the essence of budgeting is making trade-offs, and that implies that you have to be looking at the whole budget at some point. And I think this is a step in the wrong direction. I think a step in the right direction, which is one of the reasons that I really think you need to have the opportunity of reconciliation, is really some committee, such as the Budget Committee, and right now it's the only committee that could do this, that is looking in a particular policy area and saying, what are all the tools that we have at our disposal, whether it's appropriated spending or mandatory spending or tax expenditures that we are using to try to reach some particular goal, and how do we trade those off against each other? And I think that this would move us in the opposite direction.
Thank you. I thank all of you for your testimony. It's been fascinating, and we'll continue to work on trying to find where the support, majority support on both sides, I trust, I hope, for budget process reform, and continue to have as our goal a rewrite of the '74 Budget Act within the next couple of years. Dr. Rivlin, Dr. Penner, Dr. Joyce, we thank you for appearing before us today. Please be advised that members may submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and your answers will be made part of the formal hearing record, and any member who wishes to submit questions for the record may do so within 7 days. This committee stands adjourned.
Thank you.